Welcome to the Money to the Masses Podcast, putting you in control of your finances. One mic, two idiots, and, according to our latest figures, 3 listeners. Here are your hosts, Damien and Andy Leeks.
Before we start, Andy, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsors, MoneyThemasses. Now, MoneyThemasses are the largest digital wealth manager in Europe, and they create portfolios of ETFs for their clients. They're incredibly cheap and ideal for somebody who's wanting to get into investing, and perhaps for more experienced investors who don't actually want to run their own money anymore. Now, they will even offer to run the first £20,000 of any of our listeners' portfolio absolutely free if they enter the code MTTM20K into the website at moneyfarm.com. For more information, check out their website. But for now, Andy, let's get back on with the show.
Hello and welcome to episode 129 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back.
It's good to be back, Andy. It's a sunny day. You sound almost as if you've got a bit of hay fever.
Yeah, I think I have. Maybe a bit of hay fever, a bit of cold. I'm trying not to mention it too much because us men have a bit of a stigma of having man flu and moaning too much. So I'm just trying to.
Well, I did it for you in about 10 seconds of the podcast starting. So what are mates for? Hey, apart from that, how you been, Andy?
Yeah, good. It's a busy few weeks at work and the day job, and doing lots of stuff in the evening, other bits and pieces on other podcasts like the One Giant Leap podcast. So it's been a busy week this week, but very enjoyable.
Oh, that's good. I thought you were going to say you were moonlighting on somewhere else then, Andy, but it was One Giant Leap, so we're happy with that.
How's your week been?
My week's been, well, it's been good. I went to Wembley to watch my beloved Tottenham Hotspur lose to Chelsea, so that was good fun. I mean, despite what people think, I actually enjoyed the day, even though we did lose, because I thought we played really well. I thought we probably deserved it, but then I like to try and be unbiased, but obviously I am a Spurs fan. So yeah, it was a good day out. I enjoyed it. It was a shame we lost, but there's more to life than football. And even though I do, as people know, have a season ticket and have done so for nearly 20 years now, but one thing I will say before we move on, it's almost a bit of a moan. I can't believe they put the game on at 5 o'clock in the evening, because, do you know what, I don't think I've ever been to somewhere where there were so many drunk people. And when I say drunk, it was also drunk and aggressive people. And I'm not pointing this at the Chelsea fans, just them. The Tottenham fans were just as bad, and in some instances worse. Obviously, I would see more of them. So it was it was spoiled because it was such an aggressive, intimidating atmosphere. I've never been to such an intimidating atmosphere at a football match. And like I said, I've been going to football for a long time, which is a shame because I think it was it ruined it slightly. But the game itself and in the ground was good. But even some of the fans had turned on themselves and fighting each other, or at least giving verbals. Nonsense. Anyway,
I think you make a good point, but it does go to prove that you're also getting very old.
I do.
And on that note, I'm going to mention it because you possibly won't. A few special birthdays coming up in the Fay family, really, this weekend. So do you want to tell the listeners?
Well,
otherwise, I will.
Oh yeah. Well, it is my birthday. It's not a particularly special birthday this year, but it is my birthday this weekend. And obviously, I have a twin brother, so it's his birthday, and he also had a son 2 years ago, and coincidentally, it's his birthday on exactly the same day. So I don't know what it's like to have a birthday to myself. I've always shared it with one other person. We now share it, so the 3 of us have a birthday, presumably sharing the cake as well. So yeah, I've got a 2-year-old's birthday party essentially for my own happy day. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
You can treat yourself to an extra slice of cake as it is your birthday too. And I like the fact that we started the podcast with me moaning about my illness, and with you, and ending the sort of summary bit with you moaning about the fact that you never get to have a birthday to yourself. So.
Trust me, Andy. My brother and I, we always laugh when we wish each other happy birthday. Don't ask me why, but we find that quite funny. We always have done, to say happy birthday, and then somebody immediately go, yeah, happy birthday, back again. I don't know.
Incidentally, which is the oldest twin? Because the oldest twin always has the upper hand, even though it's only by a few minutes generally.
Yeah, it's him by 15 minutes. So, yeah, my poor mum. Bearing in mind, the poor woman didn't even realise that she was having twins until I think it was about 2 months before we were born, because in those days they didn't do scans like we do. I think they actually were X-rays they did then, and they don't do them very often. And she was obviously pretty big by that point. And she tells the story when she eventually found out she was having twins. She cried. I mean, because obviously I have other siblings too, so she probably felt like the woman who lived in a shoe.
Good stuff. Great. Well, that's a good catch up. What have we got coming up money-wise on the show this week?
Right, we got 3 pieces, as is customary for the show. I've got something I want to talk about to do with inheriting property. Now, it's relevant for most people. And I then want to touch upon something to do with investing. It's May. Anybody listen to this podcast, we're just about to enjoy the bank holiday weekend. So we're entering into May. And I want to touch upon this idea of these investing, mantras is the word. Selling may go away. I don't know if you've heard of it. Many people may have done. I want to touch upon that. We've mentioned it before on the podcast, but I want to talk about some number crunching around that, which people will find interesting. And last but no means least, just a bit of a catch up really on the things that have been ditched because of the general election. Now, I don't know people realise, but we had a budget not too long ago, and there were things that were going to be pushed through that were going to be part of a finance bill that has to get through. Well, given that we had a surprise election, they just started taking the old axe to loads of those things, and they've all been ditched. So some good news for people out there, and I just want to quickly sprinkle that on the podcast.
Okay, so what should we start with?
Well, I'll start with the budget thing because it's the most time sensitive, so people listening to this in the future can jump past this section. But because Theresa May called a snap election, there were too many things that were going to be included in the finance bill that would need to be debated, because when we have budgets, they state what's going to happen in those budgets and the new rules or anything that's going to be brought into law. That has to normally go through a lot of voting, a lot of toing and froing and bits and pieces before it actually becomes some form of legislation. And in order to get this stuff done before we have a general election in which people are going to have a whole new wave of promises and manifestos, they've had to just chop things up and just go, right, we're going to go with something that's really, really streamlined so we can get it through. And that means that some of the things that one of the things we talked about on a recent podcast was the dividend tax allowance. Now, there was a big change to that. So anybody out there who has investments that pay income, so it might be a lot of shares that pay dividends. You may have a company where a limited company, for example, where you pay yourself in dividends. So there'll be lots of people out there who end up having dividends as an income source. Now, you may recall that there was a dividend, or there is a dividend allowance, which you can earn £5,000 before you pay tax on. Now, in the budget, they decided to reduce that down to £2,000. Do you remember that, Andy? They sort of decided to bring that down because they were saying that the self-employed out there were having a right laugh when it came to tax, which isn't true of all people. Maybe some people are flouting the rules slightly. So we're going to reduce it down. Well, they've had to ditch that now. So that isn't happening. That was something that was going to come in next year and it was going to be put into law. But that has now had to be put on hold. So everybody out there who has limited companies, who are paying themselves in dividends or who have a portfolio, they're rejoicing. You can punch the air. That's been shelved for now. There were other thing that was actually has been stopped temporarily was to do with pension recycling. And now pension recycling is this idea that you can draw on a pension, and so you can be receiving your pension when you get to 55, but you can keep paying into a pension as well. So the idea was the rules were meant to try and they exist already, but to stop people taking money out of a pension and then putting it back into another one and getting more tax relief, because you could just keep going round and round in circles, screwing the tax man, which might sound good, but they don't like it. So what they do is they bring in rules to stop it, and they kept reducing their sort of allowance. You had an annual limit to what you could put into a pension once you were drawing on a pension. That was due to come down even more to like £4,000. It was at £10,000 for those people. Now, that's had to be shelved. So if you're doing that, I don't actually think many people do that, to be honest, not that I've come across, but people do it accidentally normally because they might be working and they may have a pension pot somewhere. They might be drawing that isn't matched to subsidise their income, but that actually means they are drawing on a pension. So that's good news for those people. That's been shelved for now. And the other thing that is something that I nearly did a piece on in the last couple of weeks was to do with probate. So if you end up, for example, having to, say your partner dies or somebody you know dies and you're actually sorting out the estate, you can end up having to go and get something called probate, where you end up having to pay a fee to be able to manage the affairs on that estate to get some money. So let's, for example, say that somebody had a portfolio of ISAs. You might have to get probate to be able to go to those companies and actually deal with those ISAs and sort things out. Well, what was happening, it was only a couple of £100, well it is at the moment, for a fee to do that. They were going to change the rules to make it to be a percentage of the estate. So it could mean that somebody could theoretically be paying thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. It was really racketing up to be able to just deal with a portfolio of ISAs that was only worth a few thousand. And so there was a big uproar about it, but I nearly mentioned it on the podcast, but I had an inkling that it might change, but that's now been ditched. So the good news is you can ignore all that, it doesn't really matter. So it's been ditched as well. So there are 3 key things that have been ditched. Keep an eye on the news and sign up to my newsletter, moneytothemasses.com/newsletter, because I pick up these things as they come out, because we've got from now 6 weeks until that election, and there are going to be probably other things that are going to be ditched or changed. And I was asked this week by a journalist, is this like party popper time? Is it good news for everybody? And should we be celebrating these things? Well, in my view, I think it might be just a temporary reprieve. And I think what will probably happen is when the manifestos come out, when people get into power, if we do get a strong government, particularly a Tory government, it may be they have the mandate and the power to do what they want when it comes to taxes. Because don't forget, in the last budget, we talked about the self-employed, they were going to change national insurance, and that got scrapped because they had a pledge, didn't they, in their previous manifesto that said they wouldn't raise national insurance. Well, they can now redefine all those rules and tear them all up, so they might actually end up being able to do what the hell they like. This isn't a political statement in any way. This is just pointing out that even if Labour somehow got in, it's that they can do what they want. So this is just about...
I like the way you say somehow got in.
But the point is, do you remember when you leave a job and you start clearing up your desk and you start sorting out all those bits you haven't done so it doesn't come back and haunt you? This is what they're doing at the moment to get these rules through. So when they go to the next job or their new position, which is if they get back in government, they can do what they like. So that's going to sort of get too excited. Anyway, that's that slot done.
Yeah, great. There is talk, like you say, that we're in the eye of the storm right now. We've, come through some really tough times. There might well be more tough times ahead, and we're just in that sort of stage of where everyone's just, keeping things easy until we get up to that election time. It's kind of, it's a strange time, really. It's certainly interesting. I'm not a political person, as you know, but I've been really reading quite a lot of press about politics and things in the lead up, because I think it's my duty now to learn a little bit more and do what I can to put my vote in the right place, because snap elections don't come around very often, and so I've got to try and take that opportunity to make my vote count.
Well, do you know what, Andy? Anybody who listens to this podcast and gets my weekly newsletter, they will have seen a piece that I did in that commentary, because I normally write something that's like personal or viewpoint often. And I mentioned in there about a lot of people saying, not another snap election. There was a woman who, I can't remember her name, that seemed to appear on every TV station when they announced it. Some older lady who was
from
there.
Bristol, wasn't she?
Yeah, Bristol, I can't remember her name. And it was almost, they were revelling in that, and it's not another one. And I personally think that's a bit of a shame that they're pushing that out there, because, I know we do get bored of voting to a certain extent, but even if you don't have party allegiances, which I don't, which is one of the reasons why I don't talk about politics a lot, and it's irrelevant to what we do, because some people have strong opinions, but you should vote even if you don't have strong opinions about a party and its politics and what it stands for, because sometimes that's very hard to tell these days. But you should vote based on your wallet, because in this world at the moment of where we're more connected and there's much more sentiment drivers, you can see things on social media that are picking up what people think very quickly. That we see stock markets crash. The pound crashed, didn't it, when they mentioned the snap election last week, and it caused it. Inflation's obviously picked up since Brexit because the pound has fallen. There's all these things that where votes themselves and elections are swinging our net worth and actually having big impacts in our lives, even if it isn't down to policies and what these... Because some people say, they're all the same once they get in. Actually, that whether that's true or not, it's these events now have more immediate impact, I think, than they probably ever did. And so you can have an election where somebody gets in and overnight the pound might crash, which will start impacting your shopping bills and all these things. So it's the reason to vote is, even if you just look at it and who am I going to be monetarily better off with, and at least engaging with something so you can understand how it's going to affect your wallet in the short term. Anyway, rant over. The point is vote.
Yes, so that was Daily Politics, brought to you by Damien and Andy. Not really. We obviously don't do politics often. Damien, what we got next?
Right, the next thing I wanted to talk about wills, and it's in particular something called discretionary will trust. Now, don't switch off, and if you heard that and didn't understand a word of it, glaze over. This is relevant because if you've got people who are, say, relatives, and particularly if you've got parents who have presumably got wills in place that you may inherit from, now this is relevant. Now, you may listen to this podcast have picked up there's a new allowance that's come in to do with property. Now, everybody gets a nil rate band allowance, and that means that you can pass on stuff to your next of kin or your next generation or to people for a value of £375,000. So that means you don't pay inheritance tax on that. Now, typically anything above that threshold is taxed at 40%. So that goes to the coffers of the taxman as inheritance tax. Now, you can inherit tax bands as well. So husband and wife. So if a husband has a tax band of £375,000, keeping it simple, if he dies, he can pass that on to his wife. So she has £650,000, which she can then pass on without paying inheritance tax. So that's keeping it fairly simple. We're not worried about the sort of odd nuances. What was brought in and came in from April in 2017 to this year was there's a new thing called a family home allowance, and the idea was that people's property was rapidly growing in values, so it was using up their nil rate band allowance, particularly in the southeast and London. So what they've done is they've started to give this new inheritance tax band that's separate to the existing nil rate band that starts to incrementally increase year on year. The key point you've got to latch on to is that by 2020 we're all going to have this additional £175,000 band. So add that together with your existing band, that means really you're going to be able to pass on £500,000 worth of stuff to your next of kin. And if you're a couple and you pass all your stuff to your wife, then your wife passes that on, and then she's got £1 million. The key thing is that £175,000 that you each have, this new band, that's the family home allowance, is applied to property. So that's only applied to your house that you live in and your main residence. So the thing is that there are certain rules around that has to be passed on to your next of kin. We've done this in a podcast. Now, the reason that I'm bringing all this back up again is that a lot of people in the past, when the rules weren't around that you could pass on your unused inheritance tax bands to your next of kin, they used to do things called discretionary will trust. So what used to happen in the past is that, let's say I died, then my nil rate band was lost and my wife didn't get it. She still had her own. It was personal to you. It was you had it yourself. They then changed the rules in 2007, which meant you could then start inheriting these bands. So you accumulated them, which quite rightly, why shouldn't you be able to? Because what used to have to happen is there were a lot of people, and we're talking, this could be in the realms, they reckon, potentially of millions, but there was a lot of people who would go to a solicitor and write up a will, so they decide who inherited their money, and the solicitor would say, you won't use your inheritance tax band, because if one of you dies first, you're going to lose it. So what we need to do is do this thing called a discretionary will trust. And very simply what it did is it took the first person to die, it took some of their money and put it into a trust, so it used their inheritance tax allowance. So I hope I'm making sense to people out there. It was a way of getting around the rules. So it's kind of pigeonholed the money, used up their inheritance tax allowance, but the spouse still had access to it. The upshot was, it was a way of you inheriting the old way it worked. It was a way of inheriting the nil rate band. The problem was, when we were allowed to inherit these things naturally anyway, and they changed the rules, that was kind of not really relevant anymore. You didn't need to do that, so it was simple. So no one has to worry about it anymore if they listen to this podcast. The trouble comes now is that sort of legacy will arrangement that people have. Now they've created this new family allowance. So if you want to be able to apply this up to £500,000 against your house, that you can pass it on tax-free. These, if you may have these will trusts that are still in your will, and they don't apply to this new allowance because the property has to be passed on directly to your children, stepchildren, foster children, grandchildren, if that makes sense. So what the whole point of this section is, if you had a will that was made before 2007, when you couldn't inherit inheritance tax bands, your nil rate band, then the chances are a solicitor would have been very clever. It was a very simple thing to do, and to minimise the inheritance tax you paid, may have put these in your will. And you may not have understood it. And the key thing is, even if you haven't, your parents might have, or your grandparents may have this in there, because they've been very savvy and avoiding inheritance tax. The thing is, if they now want to somehow pass on your property to people, they may miss out on using this new band. So the whole point of this section is, if your parents or your grandparents have made a will before 2007, then it's worth them getting it looked at again. And even if you pay for them to have it looked at again by that solicitor, just to double check that it all stacks up with the changes in how inheritance tax bands are inherited, and also this new one that applies to property, then it's worth doing. I always say you need to look at wills again and review them if there's changes in your lifestyle. So you might get married, you might get divorced, you might have children, or if there's changes in rules. And a lot of the changes don't really impact haven't made much of a difference. But now this new band, it's worth just getting an expert to cast their eye over it. It won't take them very long. They'll look at it and they'll go, nah. You might be able to do it yourself if you understand this stuff. I mean, I could look at somebody's will and go, yeah, that it's fine or whatever. But get a tax expert, sort of a legal expert, to have a quick look at it, the person who drew up the will, and it won't cost you that much because it's only a review. So it's worth doing, because it could mean that you could lose out on quite a lot of inheritance tax saving. We're talking sort of 70, 80 grand or whatever on inheritance tax that you could potentially save, that because your will is old, that you might lose out on. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Good stuff. So we're looking at investing and investing mantras, and I think one that you said earlier, which I like and I've heard before, is sell in May, go away. We're going to kind of look at those kind of things.
Well, it's that one that we're going to look at, because what you'll see is there'll be articles everywhere about do we sell in May and go away. And what it is, very quickly, it's the full mantra is sell in May, go away, come back on St. Leger's Day. And St. Leger's is a horse race that is run in September. And it's run on a not on a set date. It's I forget how they judge when it's actually run, but this race, whenever it's run on the calendar, and the idea is that all these investment bankers and brokers years ago used to swan off for the summer, and they used to sell out of the market because it gets a bit thin in trading and makes it a little bit volatile, and come back on St. Leger's Day when they'd been finished doing all their, I don't know, polo or whatever it is they do in the summer, drinking Pimm's. And it used to be seen that there was actually a market dip in the summer. And there's been a lot of research over the years. And this isn't a recent thing. This has been going theoretically for hundreds of years. And there's evidence going back that far. But the idea is you sell out the stock market in May into cash, and then you buy back in basically September. And when they looked at the analysis, it seemed to show, or it was felt, that you would always be better off if you did that. And people used to use this as a mantra. Now, I did some research into this and looked at the numbers and crunched them and said, does Sell in May actually work? If you go back to 2015, then people who'd done that, who'd sold in May and gone away and bought back in September, would have been absolutely laughing. They would have been up 11% because the market dipped. Well, they wouldn't have been up 11%, they'd have been flat, but they'd have been 11% above the market. Now, of course, that might be, people would have been sitting there thinking, oh, well, it definitely works. If you look at the numbers, actually, then it only works about 34% of the time. And if you look at somebody who just stayed invested throughout the summer on average since over the last 30 years, if they stayed invested, they would have been up about 10.9%. Then versus somebody who just done a Sell in May strategy, they would have been up 9.8%. So the figures are slightly irrelevant, but the point is it's only marginal. There's not much in it. But Sell in May doesn't typically work, but there are instances where it does. If we look at last year, it's quite interesting because if you'd done the Sell in May, you would have been coming up to the Brexit vote. The reasons to sort of sell out in the summer months, which is obviously this strategy that people sometimes follow, you would have been sitting there thinking, yeah, I reckon I'll do it because I think it's going to go chaos if we leave the European Union. And actually what happened, the market was up 12% over that period. So you'd have been 12% behind the market if you'd have done Sell in May last year. So the point is Sell in May doesn't typically work. There is something in it. There is obviously trends, but I wouldn't bet the house on it. Where it doesn't really work at all, if you look at it, is if you look at low risk investments. So if you buy things like bonds and stuff like that, the more low risk you are, the less likely Sell in May works. The more high risk stuff you buy, the really high risk equities, the more likely you are to benefit from the Sell in May angle. So what that also does is if you take that idea, you can improve the Sell in May mantra. So if instead of Sell in May and going into cash, if you go and Sell in May and you buy defensive stuff, so you go low risk, then that has definitely bumps up the strategy. It makes it actually more of an idea that could be workable, and actually there's evidence to show that it's not a bad idea, a bad thing to do. So Sell in May go away doesn't really work. It works, there is something in it, but it only works about a third of the time, and better than sort of selling out completely. If you go into more defensive stuff, take a little bit less risk, then it improves the odds of it actually working. But to be honest with you, you're better off staying invested, which is what I would do.
I hear a lot of these investment mantras, and we've talked about them before. I mean, do you support them? Do you like them generally, or do you think they're just, a bit of nonsense?
It depends on which one. Generally, they have some form of basis in them, that there is a pattern that has that's been spotted over a period of time. But I wouldn't base all your investing on it, because like anything, they tend to work very well at some point and then don't other times. And if they work like clockwork, they'd actually be arbitraged out of the market. People would actually do them and they would disappear. And so given that doesn't happen, I mean, generally speaking, I quite like I love the old idea of number crunching and looking at research, and then maybe you end up coming up with your own. But if it's something that you actually spot a trend pattern, then that's very different to just one that somebody says, Sell in May, go away. There's so many of these things. We did once do, I think, a podcast very early on a number of these mantras, and go back and listen to it if you can find it. It has got investment mantras in the title. I'd sort of look at them and debunk some of them. But generally speaking, I like them as a starting point to ponder and do a bit of research around and to test, because sometimes they, like that one there, you can veer off and actually work. There's a way of applying it. Maybe you just apply the brakes a little rather than just completely pulling up the handbrake going into cash. You could there is something in them that you can mould and change and build something yourself. So good question, but yeah, largely I don't tend to follow them. I just thought, Andy, while I'm talking to you there, going back to that earlier piece, one of the things that was ditched as well, I talked about things that are ditched ahead of the election. Before we finish, an idea struck me. There was talk of them changing the way that tax returns were going to work. They were going to say that we were going to do more frequently, like 6 a year. It was going to be kind of a rolling thing. That idea's been shelved for now as well. So anybody who was fretting about doing that kind of thing, that's been shelved.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. That just sounds like an administration nightmare. I thought they wanted to try and make things easier for people. That sounds like a nightmare. Good. Okay, we're done. What else have we got to mention? Oh, we've got something to mention regarding One Giant Leap podcast.
Do you know what, Andy? I can't believe we didn't mention this at the beginning. You did sort of tease it a bit, but yeah, One Giant Leap podcast, you've got to listen to this, because if you're a fan of this podcast, if you like this podcast,
and if you're the reviewer that said and it's all about Andy Leeks, then you'll really like this one.
You're going to love this, because on the One Giant Leap podcast this week, actually I interview Andy. Now, we've got so many people who follow this podcast, and many of them are new, so they won't know of Andy's brilliance, because the idea this week on the One Giant Leap podcast is that we're showing that lightning can strike twice, and Andy's had an incredible journey of his own, where he became the best-selling author of a number of books, topped the Amazon charts in the UK and America, and I interview Andy about that story. So if you've ever got dreams of writing a book and self-publishing and being successful and selling probably 100,000 copies, then actually Andy is the person you need to speak to, and he was very influential in me topping the business charts with my book. So I interview Andy. So if you love this podcast, you're going to love that episode, and it is all about Andy and picking his brains about how he does what he does.
Yeah, and it was difficult to squeeze it into half an hour, really, and I'm sure there's bits and pieces that I've missed. So if you are interested in self-publishing, in doing anything in terms of writing, then by all means get in touch. You can get in touch with me. We don't often announce my email address. You're more than welcome to email me. My email address is andyleeksauthor@gmail.com, so get in touch if you want to.
Yep, that's it. It's a brilliant episode, so make sure you do listen. That's it for this week. Enjoy your bank holiday weekend. You can contact me on the usual email, Damien@moneytothemasses.com. Don't forget to contact me on Twitter, which is moneytothemasses with a number 2. That is probably one of the best ways to contact me, because if you do send me something on Twitter, tweet me, and it buzzes in my pocket, I probably shouldn't tell people that, but it does. So if you want to ask me a question, it's probably the easiest, most accessible way of asking the question, and it also is a fantastic way of making people very concise about what they're asking, rather than wanting me to redo their entire finances, which sometimes I do get, which I can't obviously do for legal reasons.
Good. Okay, until next week.
Until next week, Andy.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.